მოგესალმებით, ჩვენ დღეს გვექნება ინტერვიუ ორ საინტერესო გერმანელ პროფესორთან, რომელსაც წარუძღვებით მე მათე გაბიცინაშვილი და თათო მარიდაშვილი. ჩვენ დღეს ვისაუბრებთ როგორც გლობალურ თემებზე, გლობალურ ეკონომიკაზე, კაპიტალიზმზე, თანამედროვე პოპულიზმზე, უთანასწორობაზე, ასევე შევეხებით საქართველოსაც და ვისაუბრებთ იმ პერსპექტივებზე, იმ გამოწვევებზე და რეკომენდაციებზე, რომელიც შესაძლებელია დაკავშირებული იყოს განვითარებასთან, მათ შორის საქართველოს განვითარებასთან. Dear Professor Herr and dear Professor Shultens, let's start talking and discussing about the global economy and about the financial capitalism and some inequality process which are now discussed in the world, especially in the Western world. My first question is about your recent book, which was published in 2011, and the name of the book is Decent Capitalism. Basically, what you write in the book is that since the 70s, the power and influence of global financial markets on the political process is so huge that it's changed the agenda of the politicians. For instance, you said that sometimes politicians are giving us some promises, but in the end they are implementing the agenda which is influenced by the financial markets. So what it means, could you explain briefly what does this change mean for the global economy?
Yeah, let me say first this basic idea of the book, The Decent Capitalism. The basic idea is that capitalism, unregulated capitalism, is very unstable. We have instability, investment, we have financial crisis. There are many reasons why capitalism as such is very unstable. And to have an acceptable and decent capitalism, you need regulations. You need strong regulations. And I'm a great fan of Mr. Karl Polanyi, yeah? And he argued you have three areas in which capitalism fails especially. First one, financial markets. Second, labor markets. Third, nature. So these are three areas in which capitalism fundamentally fails. And actually what happened in the 50s and 60s, after the disaster of the Great Depression in the 1930s, we had a version of a regulated type of capitalism. This came in a crisis in the 70s, and instead of looking for better alternative regulations, you could say a neoliberal revolution took place. And from the 1970s, especially then 80s and 90s, it continued. A lot of markets were deregulated. And as you have mentioned, especially financial markets were deregulated. And this led to the disaster in 2008, 2009, to the subprime crisis, to the Great Depression. But also labor markets were deregulated with negative effects. And also during this time, nature was not sufficiently protected. So I would say in all three areas, labor markets, financial markets, and ecological problems, there's a big need of re-regulation, new regulations to achieve a decent capitalism. So this is the basic idea of the book.
Yeah. So Professor Shultens, for instance, the process which Professor Herr just described also influenced on the labor market and also influenced on democracy processes, right? So you are the professor who actively writes about these economic democratic processes, about the labor's role in this whole system. So how the change in global system affected on labor and affected on democracy as such?
Yeah, first of all, I would say that the change is basic also about the change in power relations.
Right.
What we saw after the Second World War, what you called a more regulated way of capitalism was also a form of capitalism where we have a certain balance of power, where we had relatively strong trade unions, where we have quite developed labor market institutions, collective bargaining, minimum wages, all these kinds of institutions are relatively strong to give labor a good power position. And what we see from the 1970s on, going that through the change towards neoliberalism, neoliberalism, one of the main enemy of neoliberalism were the trade unions. So they attacked and they blamed the trade unions for being responsible for the crisis, and therefore they deregulated labor market, they weakened the position of trade unions, and this had an effect on the power relation that labor really becomes in a much more weaker position. And in terms of economic, this again has an impact because this creates, as the power position of unions becomes weaker, it creates a lot of problems in terms of development of labor, income. The labor share went down in almost all the advanced countries, and we see a redistribution from labor to capital income, and also an enormous increase of inequality, which is, I think, until today, the big topic we have to talk about.
May I add? I think I completely agree, especially in Germany, but in all other European countries as well, in the Western side, we had really a compromise between capital and labor. Yes. And we had co-determination, we had many institutions which reflected this balance of power. And this is one of the success stories, one of the explanations for the big success of Germany and other European countries. We have in France and Scandinavian countries, we had similar structures, and unfortunately this broke down, and then exactly what my colleague told happened. Yeah? And now we have a situation that labor overall is relatively weak in many countries, and this does not lead to good results. Yeah?
It's really important to understand and to explain that, like, the processes which started like 4 or 5 decades ago are the basis of this transformation, right? So I want you to explain us, when we're talking about this neoliberalism, this is the result of the political choices, like the political elites in the Western world decided at that time. But beside this political process, why we had this transformation? Because this neoliberal agenda, which started like decades ago, has the connection, direct connection to the financial capital. So we saw that in previous time, the financial capital was the servant of the market. Now it's the master of the market, right? Its influences on politics. So why this financial market? It's just the result of the deregulation, or how they got so big power?
Yeah, I would say it's basically. I mean, there are, of course, also in the economic debate, different theories about that and different views. But my view would basically, it's mainly about political deregulation, because financial capital could never become that strong when, if not, labor markets, financial markets were deregulated and were really, the politics allow them to behave like they behave. And of course, the connection is also related to the fact that through this growing inequality, we see in most countries really a big problem of structural demand. So you have the money and you don't know where to invest because there is no sufficient demand for this investment. And therefore, of course, it is obvious that this demand, this money goes to the financial markets, and we have all this kind to accumulate, to have, and then this creates all these financial bubbles and speculation and all these fancy projects on the products on the financial market. So I think here is a clear connection also to the real economy, that the problems in the real economy and the growing inequality also promoted this process of financialization.
So what's your solution? Like, what kind of regulations we need in labor market, according to the trade unions role? What can we do now?
I mean, if we follow the picture of Polanyi and the idea of the transformation, and Polanyi's idea was that there was always a kind of what you call pendulum, so which on one end it swing towards more the side of deregulated market, free markets, and I think definitely we are now again talking about a necessary new big transformation where global capitalism is in this process. It has been technological, but also ecological reason, economic reason. So, and definitely if you want to have a more sustainable way of capitalism, you need a re-strengthening of a regulated capitalism in general, but also in particular of labor market institutions, which means strengthen trade unions, strengthen collective bargaining, strengthen labor law, minimum wages. All these issues are very important to create a certain counterpower to the logic of capitalism in order to have a more balanced development.
Let me add and come back to the question, how could that happen?
Yeah.
That let's say, a relatively successful model of the 50s and 60s broke down. There are different approaches. My interpretation is we had three major reasons. First, academic thinking changed. We really had in academia increasing role and then dominance of neoliberal thinking. This has to do that the quality of the Keynesian models at that time, the so-called neoclassical synthesis, was not very good. Yeah. And then came the crisis in the 70s, and this was a chance for neoliberal thinkers, Milton Friedman and many others, Robert Lucas, rational expectation revolution.
To revolt.
Yeah, to revolt and gain dominance. And I think Milton Friedman and others probably, they really believed in the neoliberal models. They wanted to push the economies in that direction. And of course, this was used by really powerful groups. And here comes the financial system. The financial system really had a lot of lobbying and pushed and pushed and pushed for further and further deregulation. And this was the second point. And the third point, unfortunately, the social democratic socialist parties, which were in power in the 70s, in all countries almost, yeah, they were not able to really develop an alternative.
Mitterrand, for instance, right?
Mitterrand, yeah. Mitterrand, that he had big problems because of capital flight, yeah. So the left was not able, in a broader sense, to develop an alternative to the neoliberal vision. And then these three factors came together, and then we have the problem. And the problem is, I'm convinced, if you deregulate financial markets, you have a tendency that big financial funds, investment funds, banks develop kind of endogenously. You have a lot of economies of scale, networks effects in the financial system. Then you have a concentration of power, and multinational companies, big companies also join that power, so you have an agglomeration of big productive capital, yeah, and the multinationals and financial capital. And when you look at who has the power today,
not politicians,
not politicians. So in many countries, you really find this concentration of capital, multinationals, financial capital, and this is a situation we have, and this developed, if you like, from the 70s on.
So what do you think? Is it possible to reverse this trend at all?
Yeah, I mean, that transformation, what we saw from the 1970s going on, of course, it produced winners and losers. And the winners, of course, want to stick to that system. The winners are the financial elites, are the oligarchs, are the wealthy people, so to speak. But for the mass of the normal people, the working people, their position gone worse. So, and the question is, of course, I mean, we had this famous quote from Warren Buffett, the well-known American then. He said, we started the class war, so we, as a financial elite, started the class war, and we won. So this was his perspective. And of course, today the question is, we see that this kind of capitalism, also the free market capitalism, if you want to say so, okay, it serves the interests of some of these groups, but it is, of course, not at all sustainable. We saw that at the big crisis at the end of the 2000s, and we see it, maybe we will see it in future again, because the basic problems which have created these crises, and these are the problems of unregulated markets and of growing inequality in all our societies, they have not solved at all. So we still have to solve this problem. But I would be not so pessimistic in saying that politicians can't do anything about that. It's just the power of the economics. I think politicians, of course, have a strong power. And social movement and trade unions, and if they really stand for something, and if you really wanted to push for an alternative vision, of course there's in principle always alternatives. I mean, this is the neoliberal ideology to say there is no alternative. It's a famous phrase of Margaret Thatcher. But that's of course not true. There are always alternatives, and it depends in the end. Yeah, if social forces become strong enough also to push for alternatives.
Yeah, I think also that probably we have big changes in the near future even. In my interpretation is this neoliberal model which developed from the 1970s, 80s on is in a deep crisis. After the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, look, in Europe, interest rate is 0. The central bank is pushing liquidity in the market. Central bank has lost power. The Federal Reserve in the United States, the interest rate is almost 0. So, and the next recession is around the corner. And also the globalization model is in a crisis. In many, many countries, from the US to Germany, etc., people are frustrated. The model produced many losers, as you have mentioned, inequality, but also high uncertainty. And people feel they are not happy with the development, and they did not gain from the development. We have unfortunately a lot of right-wing reactions to that, but potentially we also could have left-wing reactions. So we are in a phase, I would say, in which a new type of capitalism, a new economic model may develop, and it may be more go in a conservative, regulated type, Trump type in the US, or it may also go more to a left type that's open, and future development is potentially very unstable, and there may be big economic, political, and social developments which open a window of opportunity to go in different directions. And what I feel, what is our task as progressive alternative economists, is to have ideas, to develop ideas. If the opportunity comes, that we can give ideas to politicians, and because the conservatives in the 50s and 60s, they were prepared. They were prepared in the 70s to step in, to give recommendations, to have a vision. And I think what we need to do as academics, but also as civil society, is to develop a vision in which direction economic development could go. And this is very, very important. We have fundamental crisis in inequality, ecological sphere, power concentration. There are so many problems, so a new vision is necessary.
So may I can remind you a moment on the situation after the big crisis in 2008, 2009. I mean, in the international debate, almost everyone was convinced that this system, financial dominated capitalism or whatever you call it, is in such a deep crisis that we could not continue with its system, that we need something else. And you have, for instance, in organizations like, let's take the OECD, for example, who was in the 1990s on the forefront in promoting all these neoliberal reforms. They completely changed their discourse. They talk about the necessary of a new growth model, of what they called an inclusive growth model, which means that growth could only be sustainable and could be really working also on a long time and did not produce this crisis if you have a balance, and if it's inclusive, that it would mean that the majority of people really could participate in that growth and could reach the fruit, and we have to reverse this enormous trend of inequality we saw all over the world. So it is not only, especially the inequality question, is not only a moral question, but it's deeply an economic question. And the discourse of the OECD, for instance, and the whole idea of inclusive growth shows that you can have only a more stable, a decent capitalism, as you call it, if it is on a more equal foot, and if it's really serve the majority of the people.
I completely agree. Also, if you look at the International Monetary Fund,
they changed.
The fund discusses now inequality, and that too high inequality prevents development. The fund recommends in certain constellations, if there's too much capital inflow, capital controls. So you are completely right. Also in the international organizations, we have a change, and this may go on if the economy does not develop in a good way, the global economy.
Could you please elaborate more on the issue of income inequality and its consequences, because it's still not clear? Because the counter-argument to your discussion would be that if the income of poor is increasing in parallel of increasing inequality, why would we care about income inequality? So should we aim for income inequality or poverty reduction?
I think basically two reasons why I think a system which is really based on an increasing inequality is neither stable nor sustainable whatsoever, will sooner or later get in big troubles, if not to say in big crisis. The first argument is an economic argument. You have, of course, all these neoliberal way of thinking. They forgot totally one crucial part of the economy, which is the demand side of the economy. They only argue from a supply side point of view, but what we see is that through growing inequality also means a structural lack of sufficient demand. And there, in the last decade, we saw almost two solutions to this demand problem. One is the debt thing, so that people got in debt. That's the American experience, that the people have no wealth at all, or many part of the people, but they are in debt, and they finance their consumerism basically through debt. Or we saw other countries, like we have it in Germany, which had enormous export surplus, and they solve their demand problems at the cost of other countries, you might say. So in that sense, you need a certain form of equality. That's also the basic idea about this inclusive growth model. You need a certain form of inequality to solve this demand problem. So this is the first, the economic argument. And the other one is probably a more political argument. I mean, of course, these people who are not at the winner side but on the poor side, they won't accept it forever. At a certain moment, they will say, why? Hey, why we are the poor guys and you are the rich guys, and we won't accept that. And then they will try to make trouble. And they can make trouble, of course, in different ways. The dominant way we see at the moment in Europe is right-wing nationalism, if not to say right-wing extremism. So because these are the forces, it seems to be, we come to a situation where on the one hand, we have the cosmopolitan neoliberals, and on the other hand, we have the national extremists who seem to solve this problem, these social problems. They don't do that, of course. The problem is that a more progressive alternative to this problem, which in principle, of course, exists, is at the moment rather weak, because the Social Democratic Party or the progressive parties are rather weak in that region, and they have a lot of problems. But to believe that this system is, I mean, just look what's happened in the world at the moment. I mean, there's no single country in the world where this neoliberal vision really functioning and is not running to a deep crisis. It's so obvious. And therefore, I think it's the crucial question where we have to care about.
I think it's pretty clear if we live in a capitalist system, and we will live probably the
very long period,
next 100 years. I don't know who knows what happens in 500 years, but in the future we can imagine we will have capitalism. So of course companies should make profit, and we also should leave decent profits in the companies. However, you have mentioned the neoliberals. The neoliberal theory makes it very clear oligopolistic and monopolistic profits are welfare reducing. And if they listen to their own models, they would argue we have to tax away big parts of this welfare-reducing, rent-seeking profits. Yeah, and so we can really use their models. And I think also in the 50s and the 60s there was the logic: if really profits are kept, decent profits in a company, and the company invests these profits. Actually, there was at that time a very close relationship between profits and investment. Profits were used for investment, and this broke down, with financialization. So if a company uses profits and is investing, fine. But what we find that huge dividend payments flow to private households, and the private households of the super rich and rich, they don't use the income for investments. They invested in the financial system, but it's not going to productive investment. And this kind of income, which is not based on any effort, so to speak, this kind of income, this really can be taxed and should be taxed on without any negative effect. Then maybe the neoliberals may argue, then we have not enough savings, but we have too much savings,
So you mentioned that we need the new model of development. So what do you think? What will be the role of industrial policy, new industrial policy in this sense? And China has elaborated plans for 2025, and Europe has followed, and they are also elaborating plans on industrial policy. What kind of industrial policy should we expect from them?
First of all, you could say all developed countries, industrial policy is practiced. And Germany, in a very, very sophisticated way, we have the biggest a German bank is a development bank. We have huge institutions to implement technologies, to create clusters, to work together with companies, to support small and medium-sized companies. And for developing countries, for Georgia, for example, or for countries which want to catch up, for these countries, industrial policy is very, very important. Otherwise, it's not possible for them to catch up. There's agreement on horizontal industrial policy, let's say education, infrastructure, etc. That's fine, but I think that's not enough. Countries like Georgia or other countries, they have to find a rational way to select tasks in global value chains or new industries, and there must be a package to support these industries, from finance to specific education to infrastructure to opening export channels. And let me also add, foreign direct investment can contribute, but foreign direct investment is not enough. And especially foreign direct investment only goes to the financial sector, goes to the
or gambling in the case in Georgia.
Yeah, then the benefit is minimal. So you need a package to support certain tasks in value chains, certain industries, including FDI, why not, to stimulate technological spillover, and then you can be successful. But to leave technological development, innovation, creation of new industries to the market, this will reproduce, so to speak, underdevelopment.
Professor Schulten, when we talk about like some state intervention and some kind of regulations which might boost the economic process, for instance, now Georgia is under the discussion of this kind of second wave of labor market changes. Like, so the government is talking about like some kind of minimum wage and this kind of social incentives. So there are people who have the argument that, it might kill the economy, like, so what do you think, like, what's the role of the minimum wage in the economic context?
First of all, I had to say, when I come here to Georgia, I was really surprised that Georgia has no minimum wage yet, or just a very, very poor form of wage regulation, because, I mean, if you look to the world, more than 90% of all countries, including all your neighboring countries here, like Armenia, Azerbaijan, Turkey, Russia, they all have minimum wages. I know, of course, these arguments that that minimum wages might create unemployment, and that's always a counter argument of the opponents of minimum wage everywhere in the world. They were discussing that. May I give you two observations. The first observation is very simple. If you look to the unemployment rate of your country and you compare it with your neighbors, you say, well, okay, Armenia I think is still a little bit higher, but all the other countries have a lower unemployment rate despite the fact that they have minimum wage and that they have proper minimum wage regulation. So it seems to be, if this theory would be true, the question is, why is your unemployment so high despite the fact that you have no minimum wage? But that's more an anecdote. But more seriously, if you really look to the academic research and to the international debate on minimum wages, you see very clearly that in the last 2 decades we have started from the US this development of the so-called new minimum wage research, and which really questioned these very simple and narrow idea of minimum wages automatically destroying jobs. What we see in almost all countries is that despite the fact of the minimum wage, it has no or almost no effect on the labor market. We see it in the US, we see it in the UK, where it was introduced in the late 1990s, and last but not least, we see it in the country we come from, in Germany. Germany introduced the minimum wage in 2015. There were also a lot of neoliberal economists who were very much against it. They said we will get 500,000, a million, or even more than a million unemployed. We're still joking, saying we're still waiting for them. So it does not happen. But what's happened in Germany, that employment was still increasing despite the fact of it. So the overwhelming evidence which we have from the minimum wages, from developed countries, but also from countries like Georgia, look to your neighbors, is there is no negative effect of a minimum wage.
But don't you think that the situation of Georgia is a little bit different because we have a high share of shadow economy? And don't you think that a minimum wage might push people in this shadow economy?
No, I think it's more the other way around. So first of all, a big shadow, we have a lot of countries, including your neighboring countries, but also in other regional world where we have a big shadow economy. So this is nothing special on Georgia. And there are also very interesting studies on the impact of minimum wages on the shadow economy. And basically it is said that the minimum wages could help to increase the income of the people working in the shadow economy.
But when you compare Georgia to also Germany, we can't really have a high growth based on demand-driven economy compared to Germany, where 80 million people live.
Okay, yeah, the minimum wage is not solving all the economic problems, of course not. It's just one instrument which could help you to have a more stable income situation for many people, which also through the demand side could help the economy. But of course that's not the solution, and probably it's also not right. Of course Germany and Georgia are very different. But what's about your neighboring countries? I mean, what about Azerbaijan? What's about Turkey? What's about Russia? Okay, Russia is different because it's also a big country. But there are many countries comparable to Georgia which have a minimum wage, and we live quite well with this minimum wage. So I don't understand the argument why Georgia should be so special in the world that it's the only country which has no minimum wage. So that's not really convincing argument.
So, professors, thank you for visiting us and taking part in the TV show. Yeah, big pleasure.